Hi, I'm Daniel from Too Sexy, and today I'm going to show you something pretty neat, which is on one hand kind of new, but it's going to make a lot of things super easy. The challenge is this: in Too Sexy, you can dynamically create content types, define their fields, and use it to do any magic you want. Now, what we sometimes have is a situation like what you can see on my screen, that we have some HTML modules or any other module, and we would still like to do something with like custom fields or something, possibly on the wrapper around it. So this is not a module itself, this is the container. And the question is, how could we actually do that? And Too Sexy's always had this concept of metadata. Now, let me first start with a very brief demo. What you can see here is just these HTML modules. I'd have to go into edit mode to see them. But let me quickly do something behind the scenes so that you can, I'm going to explain this later, but I just want to quickly make sure you see it. Just a second. Here we go. Where were we? There we go. I'm going to reload the page now. And you saw before there was just nothing happening. But now when I hover over it, I suddenly get this post-it icon. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a note to this. For example, don't forget to add content, right? Control Enter, by the way, closes and saves the dialog. Now, what you can see now is that the first module has some metadata attached to it, and these are not Too Sexy modules. These are standard DNN modules outside of the scope of Too Sexy. But I now have a note here that I could click on. I could find out that I apparently still have to do something. And that's quite powerful, right? And we're going to leverage the same mechanism to do even more. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to go back to the code here. Again, I'll just explain it in just a second. And I am now going to reload it, and I'm going to get another button. I am now going to see a metadata button, which means I can now add custom values to each and every module. I'm going to start with the second one, and I've prepared the content type already. We'll get to that in just a second. But let's just say the background color is now green. Ta-da! The module is green. This is not a Too Sexy module. It's still a normal DNN module, but the container did two things. It made sure the toolbar appears and that it picks up the settings and does something cool with it. So let's look into how this is actually done. We have a container, and by the way, the source code for all of this, I'm going to put a link there just in a moment, but we have a fairly normal container because the container itself is really just this div block here, and that's it. Here's some debug code, which we're just using sometimes to have a look at something, but ignore that for now. This is the container. And what you can see here is that we're adding a toolbar, and we're somehow getting metadata, and we're going to put the background color into the style. So how does this work? First of all, I guess it's valuable to know about metadata itself. Metadata is a piece of data which has a target address that it can be linked to something. The idea is that we have any kind of data which might come from any other system, but it has a unique way to identify it. In this case, we know that it's a module and it has an ID. And so when we create metadata, when we press this metadata button, the system will know that once it saves it, it's going to have to target it to that piece of data. And then when you need data for that element, it's going to find it again. That's how it works. So let's have, I guess the best way to start is if we look at how we're actually going to get into this. I'm going to go to just a different page for a second, or do I have any DNN? I need to quickly go to the Too Sexy modules, to the entire settings. And here I'm just going to go into the global settings. We are now on the Too Sexy settings for this single site, and I'm going to go to the apps. And for quite a few years now, basically since version 13, there's been this primary app, which probably nobody's really using. The primary app is meant for data that is not specific to any certain app, but it is specific to this site. So there are many primary apps, at least one for each site. Now, things you would typically do on the primary app, by the way, is configure settings which are scoped to the entire site. So let's say you wanted to define that my standard picture ratio was 2:1. That you would do here, okay? Or if you had some resources, like some translations that you need in many apps, you would put them here so that you can share them. But what we're also going to do now is I created this content type called module metadata. You could call it anything you want, but in this case, I'm calling it module metadata for obvious reasons. And as you can see, it has these two fields you just saw before. And if I go into the details, you'll also notice that this one here was made manually, but these here that have this little metadata flag here, this tag, those explain that they are metadata for something, specifically for one of these modules that we made, because again, they're linked to that information. So create a content type in the site app so that it's not part of a specific module, but can be used on any module. And then let's look at the container itself. I'm going to go back to here. Again, the container must do a few things. It must make sure that the toolbar appears. And of course, it must make sure that if there's a value in there, that it's actually going to do something with it. So let's have a quick look at the code. I'm going to start here on top. We have a few namespaces. Those are just important so that we can actually write our code easily. Now, here's the first and important bit. I need the ToSexy API to get access to anything. And this is now just a property of this type, right? And it is going to more or less, this is just a null check thing. It's going to get a scoped service of this thing here. You can find it in the docs. It's in the in this namespace here, but it's going to get that service. And using that service, we can get APIs for different usages. So what we want is the API of the site. We're going to give it the site ID, more or less. We're going to tell it what page we're on, and we're going to tell it what module this is about. Which means now in here, we have an object that can do a lot of things within this context. That's step one, okay? Step two is basically we are going to need this object, the myContext.module object. This is the context we're in, and we need the module because we're going to want to add metadata to it, and we're going to want to read metadata for that. So let's look at how the toolbar is made. Basically, again, it's just a toolbar. This could also be a namespace and everything, but it's a little more obvious this way. So we're just going to say we have a toolbar. It starts without any buttons at all, and then it's going to show the default recommended metadata buttons for the current module. This is what made the notes appear, because modules are kind of like preset to have notes. Same thing applies to pages, for example. So for example, up here we have a similar toolbar for a page. This one doesn't have classic metadata, but open graph metadata. It's a similar pattern. It basically just says pages know that you could add notes to them. You could drop this. Let me just demonstrate that. Whoop, wrong keyboard shortcut here. I could drop this, and in that case, the note would disappear because all we want is the metadata for the color definition. Right now it's gone, and I'm going to just make this one here pink. And so now it's gone, but let's put that back just to kind of keep on going with this. Now, the next step is to say we also, by the way, kind of want not a preset type of content, but one that's called module metadata. Again, it could have a different name, but of course it should match your system. Now, this thing is going to say we've now defined what a toolbar is like, and ta-da, we're going to put this down here into the div. So here's where the div starts, and here's where it ends. So the squiggly tags are like a special thing of ASP.NET. This is inside the div tag. This is going to make sure that everything is there so that on hover, the toolbar will appear. Now, if I just save that, let's refresh to make sure the note button appears again. So what you can also tell is that the toolbar is quite smart. It knows if there are notes, it knows if it has metadata, and it'll look different if there is no metadata yet. So there's a clear indication for this. That's how the toolbar gets there. But let's keep going. Now we want to read the values and use them. Now, we could, of course, do some kind of the classic method would be to get the entity. That's a dynamic value object in TooSexy, and then use like get string and get number. But there's a much nicer feature in the recent releases of TooSexy, which is called models. And models are, let's say, fairly simple classes which are just meant to give access, typed access to certain values. Here's the one we just made for this example. This is now called module metadata. Again, the name here should match the name of the other object. You'll just see in a second why. And basically, this is more or less just a reader wrapper to get typed access to those fairly generic properties, right? We're going to inherit from some machinery that does most of the magic. And we're going to say it has a background color. And we're going to say, get this. Get this basically finds out what the name of the property is, will retrieve it, and we can also specify a value that will be used if there's nothing set. So either if the data is not there at all, or if it's there, but the value is empty, right? So it's going to have this fallback. Everything's just going to work. Now here's where everything gets really nice. This, again, is now used here on the myModule.getMetadata model. We're specifying the model, and internally it's now going to use the name of this to find out, is there any metadata that matches this object? Because of course we've also added notes, right? We don't want to pick up the wrong piece of data and say, oh no, we don't know the background color because we accidentally found a note, because there could be a lot of metadata. So it's going to look for this metadata. And of course, if it doesn't find it, it's going to be null, in which case it's just going to give us an empty module metadata, which in this case is also going to just return the fallback, which is wiped. So I believe that all makes sense. The name again is important because that's what it's going to use to find the correct content type and then match it to this wrapper. And in the end, all we're going to do is say metadata.background color, and ta-da, the magic's there. So pretty neat, but it gets even better. So let me demonstrate how we can improve this even more. Now let's imagine we had more than one type of metadata, or this icon could confuse people a little bit. Now we're going to go to the next level using metadata again. I am now here back in, I just switched tabs by the way, back in the module metadata, and I'm going to go look at the fields again, right? Not at the fields, sorry about that. I'm going to go to the module metadata, that's the content type, which has these fields. And I want to say, in the toolbar, if I have a button metadata, let's use a different color or a different icon. Because right now it's just this generic default color and this tag signature. So let's go to the metadata of this content type. Here we can already see there's already some metadata in there. This is because metadata is used extensively in TooSexy. We're going to add a toolbar button configuration. We're going to say that on the command metadata, there could also be other commands, we want to just have a custom icon. And let's start with saying, well, the color here should be red, of course, because it's super important. Let me just save that. And if I now go back here and refresh, the button is now red. And let's assume that that's not all that we want to do. I have an SVG here somewhere. Let's say we also would like a different icon. Then I can just paste this into here, save that again, and refresh that again. And now suddenly I have a different icon for that button. So you just saw how to create metadata for something different, in this case, a module. You've seen how to use best practices to access it and to convert it into a typed model to easily and safely use in your code. And you've even seen how to customize the button to be very specific to your needs. This is pretty cool. You can use it for so many things. Just figure it out yourself. I'm going to link the docs here or here. Not sure which way the video is going to be. But yeah, follow the link here for more instructions and have fun with TooSexy. Thanks for watching. I'm Daniel.